Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Today I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about KlimaDAO. I'm mostly going to focus on an initiative we worked with our home chain Polygon on to develop a climate positive strategy, first for their proof of stake blockchain where our protocol runs, and more broadly for their organization. As many of you may know, Polygon runs sort of a network of blockchains. The proof of stake network was their first, and now they're developing ZK rollups and a variety of offerings that will help enterprises to adopt blockchain technology. So I want to give a very brief overview of sort of my perspective on the role of offsets and the role of carbon credits in the green transition and the fight against climate change. So there's this sort of prevailing narrative that offsetting is only good for greenwashing and it doesn't really have a major impact on the climate. But the IPCC begs to differ. They're very clear that in addition to substantial direct emissions reductions, there is no path to 1.5 degrees C that doesn't involve significant carbon dioxide removal. So the question is, how do we get there? This is a report from McKinsey. I don't want to go into the details, but the basic idea is this red section here. That is all the negative emissions we need. So there's really not a lot of time to start significantly reducing the carbon emissions that are up there, as well as reducing the emissions that are ongoing. So where do these offsets that we talk about actually come from? I know we're all sort of familiar with the basic setup of the VCM, so I won't spend too long on this, but basically you have a variety of players on the supply side and the demand side. This is sort of an illustration of the traditional voluntary carbon market, and some of these pieces are in the process of being adapted for blockchain. In particular, Klima is operating sort of in this bottom right-hand corner on the demand side of the market, trying to improve access and reduce transaction fees for people acquiring and retiring carbon credits. So there's this whole argument about removal versus avoidance. We've heard a lot about it today, especially in the roundtable yesterday. There was some really great heated discussion that I enjoyed participating in about sort of the role of avoidance and removal. And this is just sort of an overview of the different technologies. Don't want to go into it, but the key distinction here is that a removal is taking carbon dioxide that's already been emitted, taking it out of the atmosphere. An avoidance or reduction credit is avoiding emitting that carbon in the first place. My personal perspective is that a ton avoided is much better than a ton removed if we can sort of have our cake, because obviously if we sort of burn down rainforests and then draw down the carbon with direct air capture, we're not really solving the underlying problem of managing our ecosystems and our planet as a public good. So avoidance plays an important role, but long-term removals are absolutely necessary. And this chart sort of illustrates, I'm drawing this from a report by Respira, that basically it's a nuanced issue. Right now, the primary source of carbon offsets comes from avoidance-based methodologies, such as renewable energy conversion or protecting existing rainforests and natural ecosystems. But the problem is that avoidance does not scale, because there's only so many trees to protect. There's only so much renewable energy to convert before it becomes non-additional. And so over time, the idea is that the avoidance market, that is where the carbon offset market is today, will go down because it'll cap out. And then the removal credits, which are very much not in the market today, will scale up as that technology is developed and we get more capital flowing into the space. And the idea is that sort of in the steady state, removals are the mechanism by which we accommodate the ongoing emissions that will not be able to be mitigated or will be difficult to mitigate in the near term. Okay, so that's a brief overview of sort of the offset market, my perspective on things. Now I want to talk about the work that we did with Polygon. So we launched on Polygon back in October for a variety of reasons, but the main one is that at that time, we looked at the sort of landscape of blockchains, especially in the Ethereum ecosystem, because our underlying tokenomics is forked from Olympus, and so it was convenient for us to be able to use Solidity, not have to re-implement a bunch of functionality. So we were looking at the L2 ecosystem specifically because obviously if we were running on ETH L1 and claiming to be a climate positive project, it would be sort of indefensible at this stage with proof of work. So we looked at Polygon basically because they offer a very high transaction throughput with a relatively minimal environmental impact because of the sort of nature of their consensus mechanism. I don't want to spend too much time talking about their consensus mechanism, but we will have to go over some basics. Okay, so the nature of this engagement is that KlimaDAO has been working with Polygon since launch to try to get this initiative rolling. We finally got traction with them a couple months ago, and we worked with a partner of ours, Offsetra, who has developed the carbon.fyi footprint calculator for ETH L1 emissions. And basically Offsetra's business involves helping organizations calculate their emissions and source carbon credits. And we basically are working with them to try to provide a more streamlined way for their customers to source offsets and retire them. on chain. So basically KlimaDAO engaged with Offsetra on behalf of Polygon to do a calculation exercise, and then Polygon used the KlimaDAO ecosystem of tooling to actually source and retire the carbon offsets for this initiative. Okay, so some basic ideas. This is drawing from the UCL blockchain environmental impact study. This is sort of a general equation for thinking about the energy consumption of a staking node in a proof of stake network. So the general idea is that you have some amount of energy consumed for each transaction, and the way you calculate that is by multiplying the number of validators on the network with the power consumed by each validator, and then you divide that obviously by the number of transactions in a given unit of time. So fairly straightforward calculation, but there's a lot of variables here. And as the previous speaker was speaking about in terms of the rigor of these models, obviously this is going to be very sensitive to each of these variables. The one that's going to be really sensitive to is the power consumed by a validator node. So the power consumed and the breakdown of that power in terms of the grid composition varies based on region. And so a simple way that you can sort of approximate the grid composition is just breaking things down by geography. So we've got North America, Europe, Asia, LATAM, and Africa. You can see that the Polygon validator node set is spread across this this geography with about 75% in the, or 65% in the developed Western world. North America and Europe. So the really nice thing about Polygon is that we know exactly where the validators are, because Polygon uses this sort of hybrid proof of authority, proof of stake mechanism where to become a validator, you have to go through Polygon. But once you're a validator, the validators achieve consensus through proof of stake. So they know exactly who their validators are. They know what hardware they're running. And so a lot of the uncertainties that are present in the more distributed networks are able to be accounted for a little more accurately in the case of Polygon. So one quick thing on this. Basically, each of these regions has like an emissions factor, right? That is available in the literature, and we're going to use that emissions factor to calculate that value P, the power consumption, and how much carbon intensity that P factor has. Okay, so the next thing we have to think about is what are the transactions that can be attributed to the Polygon network? And there's really, this breaks down into a couple of major segments. On one hand, you have the Ethereum L1 transactions that are associated with the operation of the Polygon L2. And that is actually going to be the majority of the emissions. The emissions of the Polygon validators themselves are quite small because it's running proof of stake. So, whereas the proof of work emissions from the L1 are obviously much more carbon intensive. So we've got two major sources that we looked at for Polygon's L1 emissions. On one hand is the checkpointing on the left-hand side, and then bridging on the right-hand side. So checkpointing is this sort of technical process whereby the Polygon L2 writes a summary of the network state back to the Ethereum L1, which is the connection, essentially. It's what makes it an L2. The idea is that if the Polygon POS network ever went down, or if the validators could not reach consensus, you could restore the network back to the latest checkpoint from the Ethereum L1 with confidence that the network state at that time was had consensus. And then the bridging emissions is another factor that Polygon was very interested in us looking into, because they operate a proof of stake bridge, which was the first bridge to bring assets to Polygon and is still the bridge with the majority of the transaction volume. So they wanted to make sure that they accommodated for that, because it is kind of a key part of their operation. If you can't get assets onto the chain, what is it really good for? So you can see here the distribution over time, and obviously Polygon has seen dramatic adoption during DeFi summer, and the bridging really picked up in mid-2021. The variation over time is not super interesting here, but basically what you can see is that they had a major adoption, and the amount of CO2 is proportional to the amount of transactions, the amount of traffic on the network. So this is sort of a breakdown of the historical emissions as well as the more recent, like last year emissions. We did this analysis in February. So the total emissions is 90,000, whereas the last year is 85. That's kind of what I was saying just now, that basically the more transaction volume you have, the higher the emissions are going to be, especially from bridging. Yeah, this is a summary. I don't want to spend too much time, but this is sort of how it breaks down. And what you can see here, the main takeaway is that most of the emissions have happened quite recently in the last year, and most of it is driven by these two Ethereum L1 aspects, which is the checkpointing and the bridging. And the bridging is actually the vast majority of the emissions. Okay, so there's a big sort of elephant in the room. If you've read the Digiconomist analysis of the Polygon network, you know that he makes a stink about the Ethereum L1 MATIC transactions. So the gist of this is that the MATIC token is the gas token on the Polygon proof of stake network, and it's also the token the validators have to hold and stake in order to sort of participate in validation. And the question that Digiconomist raised, or rather the assertion that he made in his analysis, is that any transaction of the MATIC token on the Ethereum L1 network should count toward Polygon's operational emissions, which I disagree with for principled reasons. And the main reason is that this assumes that the only way to get your hands on MATIC is to go to Ethereum L1 and trade for it, which is absolutely untrue. Back at the very beginning of Polygon, there was some sense in which there weren't DEXs yet on Polygon, and so there was a need to get it from other sources, but it was trading on centralized exchanges pretty soon after launch, and most importantly, the validators actually received an airdrop of MATIC at launch to enable them to bootstrap the network. So to argue that somehow you have to go to Ethereum L1 to be a validator, and therefore it's essential to the operations of the network, seems a pretty weak argument to me. And the thing is, it blows the calculations out of the water. It's about double the size of the bridging component that we just looked at. So Polygon's total emissions would be more than double what we calculated. So it's an open question. If you have a good argument as to why the Ethereum L1 MATIC transaction should be included, I'm happy to hear it. But for the purposes of this analysis, we excluded it because we don't think it's essential to the operations of the network. Okay. So this is just some context for sort of what the calculated emissions look like. This is only including the last year's emissions, Feb 21 to 22. And you can see that Polygon sort of in line with a lot of other technology companies. Most notably, I think PayPal is a really interesting comparison here because they're a payment network. And part of what Polygon does is, it's a payment network. You can send, stable coins and digital assets, but it also does a lot of other stuff like hosting carbon markets. So I think it's pretty clear demonstration that this technology is sort of is a reasonable replacement for the existing payment rails, at least when we look at carbon intensity. And the other cool thing here is that this is still including Ethereum proof of work, right? So there's this whole other aspect that once the Ethereum L1 moves to proof of stake, the ongoing emissions from the Polygon L2 are going to drop dramatically because the Ethereum L1 emissions are the majority of the emissions. And then you see some comparisons with some other more things you might be more familiar with, like the impact of flying from London to New York, or how many barrels of oil this amount of carbon tonnage would be equivalent to. Okay, so we've heard a lot about sort of the problems with offsetting, and very much agree that net zero is not enough. In fact, even if we all got to net zero today, we would still have 1 trillion tons of carbon up there in the atmosphere. And so it's very much a first step. And it's important, I think, that we recognize that that's where the corporate market is today. And that's the way that most organizations are framing their climate commitments. But Polygon was very clear, and we expressed this very strongly to them, that just offsetting one-to-one is not enough. There's additional initiatives you can take on. One thing is just to offset more than one-to-one, just to go beyond the net zero. And as well, putting money toward initiatives that support the development of protocols and on-the-ground work that contribute to the fight against climate change more broadly, including the development of new technology. So we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so Polygon worked with Klima to publish a love letter to the planet, which is sort of our way of basically making it fun and engaging and inspiring to offset carbon on-chain, to retire carbon on-chain. So they embedded this message permanently onto the Polygon blockchain as part of their retirement. I think it's pretty clear that they don't just want to one-to-one offset. Really, they want to commit to supporting an ecosystem of products and services that are going to accelerate the fight against climate change. Okay, so this is a little overview graphic of what actually went down when we consumed the offsets. Oh, wow. I think I skipped a second. Hold on. So before we get to going beyond offsetting, we have to talk about what they actually did. Basically, Polygon worked with us to identify projects that they wanted to support, and we helped them to develop essentially a strategy of different offset consumption. The idea here is that there's a tension between the supply of offsets and the price that those offsets fetch. You can pay as much as $1,000 a ton for direct air capture, or you can pay $2 a ton for large-scale renewable energy. And so in our view, it's a balance, right? You need to be using a mix of offsets in order to sort of cover the spectrum of actions that are necessary to accelerate the fight against climate change. So you can see on the left some of the projects they chose. I'll show some real world pictures of those projects in a moment. But the point is, it's a variety of projects going from forest conservation to wind energy installation, solar, and some other projects as well. But the general idea is, these carbon projects get registered with the registry like Vera, bridged via a group like Toucan or Moss, and then KlimaDAO provides liquidity for these assets on Polygon so that anyone can acquire them reasonable transaction fees compared to the legacy market. We're talking like maybe a percentage point or less. And then finally, you retire them. They retired them with our KlimaDAO retirement aggregator, which really just makes it easy to consume a variety of different offset types. So like Moss and Toucan have slightly different retirement processes, and yeah, you could go and work with each bridge individually, but it's kind of a pain, especially if you want to automate this stuff, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so what did they do? So they retired about 104,000 tons, of which 90,000 is a large-scale renewable energy project from China, which is quite controversial, and I'm happy to talk about my perspective on large-scale hydro and sort of the nuance that exists in this question. But they also retired 10,000 tons of selective projects, where they went into the BCT pool and they identified projects that align with their organizational goals. They're based in India, so they were really interested in projects in Southeast Asia in general, but in India in particular. So they identified a wind project, Jahib, and they also identified a solar project in India that they supported, I think, about 5,000 tons each. And then they also did a little bit of this project in Southeast Asia called Bull Run, which has a great name, and also is doing some really important work protecting forest and empowering local communities to resist poaching and deforestation. In addition to the BCT pool, they also used Moss's MCO2 token, about 5,000 tons. And Moss is really focused on the Amazon. Their projects are using the Red Plus methodology from Vera to basically prevent deforestation of this really important natural resource in the Amazon, which is under very real threat of being destroyed because the regulations in Brasilia and in the Amazon are not sufficient to protect the rainforest, even in areas that are considered natural preserves. So Moss is doing some really great work on the ground with these communities to empower them and drive capital into local communities living in the Amazon. So they put some there as well. Okay, so now we get to next steps for Polygon. Beyond offsetting, they've allocated $20 million to what they're calling the Polygon Green Fund. And the idea here is to support the development of tooling, infrastructure, and research related to the on-chain carbon markets in particular, but sustainability initiatives in general. Yet to be seen exactly where that money's going to go, but I imagine it'll be run as a grant program, kind of similar to the other sustainability funds that we've seen on other chains. And we're also working with them to develop a coalition specifically around digital carbon markets. We really think it's important that for carbon markets, one of the biggest issues on the demand side is the lack of liquidity in the legacy world. And we think it's important that we concentrate that liquidity in the on-chain world and we don't sort of recreate the fragmented landscape that we see off-chain. So we're working on some cross-chain solutions, and we want to work with Polygon to basically make their chain the home of carbon markets on-chain and allow access from other chains to consume those liquidity pools and to retire carbon on Polygon from whichever EVM chain you happen to be running on. That way we don't end up in a situation where we have, a fraction of each pool's liquidity spread across a bunch of different chains. So keep an eye out for that coalition being formed. We're working with them to establish that. Okay, so in addition to offsetting the historical emissions in the last year and from launch, they also want to ongoingly consume retire credits as a response, an automated response to the real-time consumption of Ethereum L1 block space, as well as other forms of activity on Polygon. So we're working with SushiSwap to build in a sort of green fee into the DEX experience, so that as a DEX user, if you're swapping a token, that you would pay a slightly increased transaction fee, and that portion of the fee would be used to purchase and retire carbon on your behalf. They also want to automate that checkpointing and bridging emissions offsetting, so that, say once a day or once a week, they would calculate the emissions from that week, and an automatic system would call our retirement aggregator contract and retire the appropriate amount of carbon, ideally at like a 2x factor. So we're really pushing them to be climate positive. That is one thing I did want to point out. They calculated emissions was about 90,000 tons, and they offset about 104,000 tons. So we went slightly beyond the one-to-one. We're pushing them for 1.5x. Hopefully some of the 20 million can be used to sort of top that up and really demonstrate that this is not about a one-to-one matching, but about putting our money where our mouth is and demonstrating our commitment to this important initiative. Okay, so the other aspect is that, Polygon has the POS chain, which is what I've been talking about, but there's a bunch of other things that they do that have emissions. For instance, they host a lot of conferences, they've got a global workforce, and they've also got a bunch of other infrastructure that's off-chain. So we want to work with them to analyze those emissions as well and offset that, ideally, 1.5x or 2x. So that's to come. And I just have some links here. You can find most of the information that I've presented here on our blogs. So the Polygon blog has some details on the Green Manifesto and the Green Fund that they're setting up. And then the KlimaDAO blog has information on this emissions analysis, as well as on sort of a more general overview of the on-chain carbon markets. The love letter page is something I sort of briefly mentioned, but you can, if you're interested in offsetting your own emissions, whether it's for travel to this event or for your own life, we have this love letter campaign where you can use a credit card or a digital wallet to source and retire carbon on chain and leave a love letter to the planet that will be published and is shareable on social media and whatnot. So we really want to drive, the social pressure and the social verification aspect of carbon offsetting so that we can get all of our friends and all of our family to start supporting these important projects. Cool. So that's the presentation. If you want to talk more about KlimaDAO or Klima Infinity, if your organization is looking to develop a climate positive strategy, please let us know. We have a partnerships team that has expertise in this area and is happy to work with you to develop an on-chain offsetting strategy. Thank you.